Did you know that much of what Europeans discovered about Africa was already known to Africans themselves? This is the story of how Africa was mapped, a story of trade, conquest, and the struggle to define a continent. Our journey begins long before European explorers, in the ancient world, where the earliest surviving written geographic references to Africa emerged from the Mediterranean. Greek and Roman authors like Herodotus, Strabo, Pliny the Elder, and especially Ptolemy, laid the foundation. Ptolemy's Geographia, from around 150 CE, was incredibly influential. It introduced latitude and longitude, creating a grid for mapping the world. However, details regarding the interior of Africa remained largely speculative, built on limited knowledge and, at times, pure conjecture. The first millennium saw a surge in geographic understanding, fueled by Islamic geographers. Trade and travel across the Sahara and the Indian Ocean opened new pathways of knowledge. Al-Idrisi, working for Roger II of Sicily in 1154, produced maps that were far more detailed and accurate than contemporary European works. Ibn Battuta, the renowned traveler, journeyed extensively through North and East Africa, documenting his experiences. Al-Bukhari, in the 11th century, described the powerful West African kingdom of Ghana. These Islamic scholars benefited from extensive trade networks connecting Africa with Eurasia, sharing vital geographic information about ports, caravan routes, and powerful kingdoms. By the 14th century, significant advances had been made. The Catalan Atlas, created by Abraham Cresques in 1375, stands out as one of the most detailed medieval maps of Africa. It illustrates North Africa, the Sahara, and parts of sub-Saharan Africa, reflecting the growing trade connections. Around 1389, the Da Ming Hunyi II, a Chinese world map, provided one of the earliest surviving depictions of Africa on a global scale. The 1500s marked a turning point as European map-making expanded rapidly, driven by Portuguese exploration. Bartholomew Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, opening a sea route to the east. Vasco da Gama reached India via the Cape in 1498, establishing a direct trade link. Abraham Ortelius published the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum in 1570, often considered the first modern atlas. Yet, even then, maps of Africa contained vast blank spaces, particularly in the interior. Speculative rivers and mountains filled the unknown regions. The 17th and 18th centuries saw European maps becoming more detailed along the coast. Coastal fortresses, trade centers, and navigable rivers were accurately depicted. However, the interior of Africa remained largely a mystery to Europeans. It was the 19th century that brought radical change, fueled by European exploration and colonial conquest. Richard Burton and John Hanning Speke explored East Africa in the late 1850s. Maps like Johnson's Africa in 1866 reflected this increasing, yet still incomplete, European knowledge. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 formalized the rules for the European partition of Africa. Maps became tools for colonial administration, defining borders, railways, and resource extraction zones. But what about the African states that existed prior to this European mapping? Between 800 and 1600 CE, powerful empires flourished. The Ghana Empire, the Mali Empire, the Songhai Empire, Kanem-Bornu, the Ethiopian Empire, and the Swahili city-states all left their mark on the continent. They possessed their own geographical knowledge, passed down through oral tradition, trade routes, and local expertise. 1960 is often called the Year of Africa, with 17 African countries gaining independence, dramatically altering the political map. In 1990, Namibia became independent, marking one of the last major milestones in African decolonization. And in 1994, South Africa's first democratic election ended apartheid, reshaping the political landscape of the region. Today, Africa is the second-largest continent, with 54 sovereign states and a population of over 1.3 billion people. The continent is typically divided into 5 key geographic regions: North Africa, West Africa, Central Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa. It's crucial to remember that European maps didn't emerge in a vacuum. They relied heavily on Arab and Swahili coastal trade knowledge, Moorish, Berber, and North African scholarship, and the invaluable contributions of African informants, guides, interpreters, and merchants. Many so-called discoveries were simply repackaged African and Afro-Eurasian geographic knowledge. The common phrase that Africa's interior was unknown on old European maps is misleading. Long before Europeans mapped the interior, African societies had detailed local knowledge of river systems, caravan routes, mining areas, political frontiers, and ecological zones. Consider the Niger River trade network, the Ethiopian highland mapping traditions, and Swahili Indian Ocean navigation. Medieval and Renaissance maps often blended verified coastlines with hearsay from traders, biblical legends, and mythical creatures. Depictions of the Sahara and southern Africa were especially prone to these fantastical elements. It's easy to assume that the lack of detail simply meant ignorance. But maps also reflected existing cultural beliefs and myths. What's also important to remember is that African map-making traditions existed outside of Europe. Ethiopia developed manuscript and church-centered geographic traditions. Islamic scholars in North and West Africa produced geographic texts and route knowledge that served as mapping tools, even when not presented as formal cartographic maps. Many African societies recorded geography through oral route memory, boundary knowledge, pilgrimage routes, trade itineraries, and palace records. The scramble for Africa fundamentally changed the purpose of maps. Before the late 19th century, maps were largely descriptive or commercial. After the Berlin Conference, maps became instruments of colonial partition, tax collection, rail and port planning, military control, and mineral extraction. European mapmaking was not a neutral exercise. It directly facilitated colonization. Once boundaries were drawn on paper, they were often enforced by force on the ground. Colonial maps transformed fluid spaces of trade, migration, and overlapping sovereignty into fixed lines. Pre-colonial African polities often had overlapping authority, tribute systems, and flexible frontier zones. Colonial mapping imposed hard borders that frequently ignored ethnic, linguistic, ecological, and political realities. Maps also shaped economic activity. They identified and prioritized ports, rivers, mineral zones, plantation regions, and rail corridors. This helped colonial regimes extract gold, diamonds, copper, ivory, rubber, palm oil, and, of course, labor. Moreover, maps influenced racial and cultural narratives. European maps often encoded African inferiority by leaving the interior blank, emphasizing unexplored space, and centering Europe as the source of knowledge. This reinforced colonial ideologies that portrayed Africa as empty, static, or primitive, despite its rich political and economic history. After independence, African governments used cartography to establish administrative boundaries, manage censuses, plan infrastructure, settle border disputes, and assert sovereignty in international law. Even today, colonial-era borders continue to affect politics. Examples include the Ethiopia-Eritrea border disputes, the status of Western Sahara, Cameroon-Nigeria disputes around the Bakassi Peninsula, Sudan-South Sudan border issues, and Somalia's contested territorial claims in the Horn of Africa. Modern mapping remains intertwined with resource extraction, influencing the control of oil blocks, mining concessions, offshore gas, water basins, logging zones, and land tenure. Today, Africa is heavily mapped through satellite imagery, GIS, OpenStreetMap, national land registries, and mobile phone geolocation systems. This has improved disaster response and planning but also raised concerns about surveillance, land grabs, and unequal data control. African scholars and institutions are increasingly challenging colonial map legacies by restoring African place names, documenting indigenous boundaries, preserving oral geographic knowledge, digitizing historic African archives, and producing locally controlled spatial data. Discussions about African unity, infrastructure, and trade often depend on how Africa is mapped, including regional economic blocks, trans-African highways, rail corridors, river basin management, and continental projects like the African Continental Free Trade Area. The story of African maps is not just about lines on paper. It's a story of power, knowledge, and the ongoing struggle to define the continent on its own terms.